Welcome back to Foresight Radio, the podcast where we look around the corner of AI to try to make sense of the weird, wonderful, and occasionally worrying world of the future. I'm Tom Kalopoulos. Today, we're diving into a fascinating question that's been sitting at the heart of AI ethics, but it hasn't quite had a proper field test. That is until now. And the question is, what does AI actually value? Not what we think it should value, not what it says it values, but what shows up in the wild when no one's watching, no one's prompting it with ethical dilemmas in laboratory conditions, just the messy, real-world interactions between humans and machines. So let's start off with a bit of framing. When you ask your AI assistant whether you should leave your job to pursue your dream, ask it about a relationship, ask it whether pineapple belongs on pizza, or how to talk to your teenager about anxiety, you're not just asking for facts. You're actually asking for judgment or implicit values. These are those tiny philosophical acts of triage that we all conduct when we're faced with dilemmas that involve ethics and values and morals. And now, thanks to Anthropic's new study called Values in the Wild, you'll see a link to that in the podcast notes, we finally get a look behind the curtain at the wizard. They analyze over 300,000 real-world Claude conversations. Claude, by the way, is Anthropic's AI model, in case you're new to this, to see what values Claude is actually expressing in real-world use. This isn't your typical AI benchmark, right? This is values at scale, data nuance, a whole lot of psychology is involved in this because we're polling real-world interactions. It's all pulled from raw human-machine interaction. So, what did they find? First of all, AI doesn't have a clean, tidy, neat set of moral commandments that are etched in its silicon. Instead, it behaves more like a values mirror that we hold up to ourselves, reflecting, adapting, sometimes resisting, depending on the context of the conversation. What Anthropic found was that in over 3,300 distinct AI values that were expressed in these conversations, there was a range of different ways that AI expressed its values. Things like helpfulness and professionalism, to things like emotional validation or intellectual curiosity, even exhibiting what we'd call healthy boundaries as humans. The top 5 most common AI values: helpfulness, professionalism, transparency, clarity, and thoroughness. So in other words, Claude's basically your overly competent office manager. It's polite, it's prepared, it's quietly judging your spreadsheets. But what makes this study so compelling is the nuance. Values weren't evenly distributed. Some showed up on only specific situations or contexts. Human agency, for example, popped up in discussions around tech ethics, while mutual respect showed up in relationship advice. It's like the AI was tailoring its moral compass on the fly, changing its true north depending on the context of the conversation. Even more interesting, however, I found, was that Claude would push back. About 3% of the time, it actually resisted user values, especially when the users, those interacting with Claude in this case, when the users expressed things like moral nihilism or tried to coax it into rule breaking. In those cases, in those moments of moral triage, if you will, it invoked its own set of ethics. Things like harm prevention, ethical integrity, and constructive engagement. I'd encourage you to look at the report because I'm fascinated by the degree to which it is reflecting our own values, but it's doing it in a contextual way. It's actually applying the values based on the context. Now, I don't want to get into an interpretation of the findings here that might be well beyond what the data suggests, but it almost felt as though it was being politically astute. In other words, understanding the context, what you'd expect, what that conversation required, and then responding in kind. And here's where it gets kind of juicy. We tend to talk about AI values as if we can bake them in, right? Make them part of the DNA of the AI, like cookies with a pinch of fairness and a dash of transparency. But what this study shows is something far more complex. AI values are relational. They emerge through interaction, and they're often, in most cases, the majority of cases, context specific. Again, going back to this notion of being politically precise, depending on the conversation. In some ways, this is eerily human, right? It's just like us. AI doesn't hold one monolithic value set. And you think about this from culture to culture, there are some things that are more absolutes, but there are so many more things that are valued differently in different cultures. And AI shifts depending on the conversation. It shifts depending on the stakes, the tone. And just like us humans, it sometimes mirrors the room. It reads the room, for lack of a better term. For better or for worse, our values can be shaped by the context of the cultures that we happen to inhabit in that moment. And these could be microcultures within an organization or macrocultures on a global scale. I mean, I know personally that I've grown up in different cultures. I was born in the U.S., I was raised in Athens, Greece, and I do find myself adopting a slightly different set of values depending on the context that I find myself in. It's not a radical shift, but it's a subtle shift, and it's noticeable to people who are around me. My kids, in other words, they see that shift when I go back to Greece with them and I express myself and my values, not so much my moral or ethical compass, but there's a slight deviation in how I behave. And that mirroring effect I find is fascinating, right? That reading the room is especially interesting. When users express values like authenticity or creativity, for example, Claude often reflected them right back to the user. But when people express deception or manipulative behavior, Claude didn't go along. It didn't stick around for the ride. It pulled out the moral override and actually said no thanks. And it's worth noting here that most of these values aren't philosophical platitudes, right? They're pragmatic, epistemic even. They're historically accurate, logically coherent. It's the form of strategic thinking. These aren't values of a guru on a mountaintop. These are values of a really sharp and politically astute analyst, which tells me something important. Claude, and probably other LLMs, although this study was specifically done by Anthropic for Claude, it and probably other LLMs like it are primarily cognitive assistants. They're not ethical sages. They're not our gurus. Their values are grounded in doing things well, but not necessarily deciding what's right. And here's the kicker. Even when they get it right, I think we still need to ask, whose values are these that they are expressing? Just because an AI resists deception doesn't mean it understands truth. It doesn't mean it has a moral compass that somehow tells it not to deceive. Just because it values empathy doesn't mean it feels empathy. I've had a conversation with a local CEO of a medical center here in Boston who told me that the ambient listening that they used in clinical settings, an AI that would listen in on the conversation between a physician and a patient, in its notes that would then be posted to the patient's portal, the AI actually seemed, based on the patient's feedback, as more empathetic than the doctor was. Fascinating, right? Anthropic calls this dynamic value expression. And we can't ignore the upside of this. If AI can learn to reinforce positive human values like empowerment, mutual respect, community building, all of these good things that as a society make us more positive in our approach and our behaviors, it could become a sort of force multiplier for good behavior, for positive behavior. The kind of assistant that not only gets your task done, but helps you to be a better version of yourself. And I've often said this, that I do see AI holding our feet to the fire, calling us out, saying things such as what you're doing doesn't serve the best interests that you've expressed in your own values. Imagine an AI saying that to you, holding your feet to the fire, the way a spouse or a partner or a family member that you're very close to might also do. That is a definite upside, right? But to have that kind of result, I think we need to develop better tools for mapping, measuring, and guiding these values. Anthropic's work is a start here, a definite start, but it's just that. It's only a start. We need transparency in how values are shaped during the training of an AI, how they shift over time because values morph clearly, and how they respond across cultures, as I was saying earlier, languages and moral frameworks. Language itself is a manifestation of culture. In many languages, including Greek, when you refer to someone with respect, you use the plural of that individual. You refer to them in the plural sense to show respect. It's interesting that in English, we use the royal we to refer to ourselves in the plural. A slight but interesting shift of cultural values, right? Whether we like it or not, these systems are not blank slates. They're dynamic, they're reflective, and they're already shaping billions of daily decisions and many more as we go forward. So, what does AI really value? Turns out it values a lot. Some of it's good, some of it is questionable, and some of it, just like us, depends entirely, as we said, on the situation. The real challenge ahead isn't just to teach AI what we value. It's to understand how those values play out in the wild, which is what Anthropic did with this study, how they evolve in the messiness of real life, and how we then build systems, AI systems, collaborative systems that can both reflect and challenge us when it matters. Thanks for tuning in to Foresight Radio. In this episode, I hope I made you think or made you mildly uncomfortable. If I did, then I've done my job. You can find more at foresightradio.com and at TK Speaks. And of course, you can interact with my virtual self at cyberself.net, where you'll find 24/7 updates on news in the realm of AI. If you're enjoying Foresight Radio, be sure to subscribe and share it with friends and colleagues. The best way to navigate the future is to keep asking questions, embrace change, and seek out new perspectives. Until next time, I'm Tom Galopoulos. As always, stay curious.